In this video, we'll be looking at analyzing the bargaining power of buyers and suppliers. The competitive environment of any industry includes rivalry among competitors, the threat from new entrants, the bargaining power of customers, the bargaining power of suppliers, and the availability of substitutes. This video will look at the bargaining power of suppliers and the bargaining power of customers. So a lemonade stand has both buyers and suppliers. The suppliers of the lemonade stand include all the ingredients to make lemonade. The buyers from the lemonade stand are the customer who buys the lemonade. It's important to take note that the buyers are not necessarily always the end users. Here's an example. A large bakery that makes cakes has suppliers, eggs, flour, and milk that are necessary ingredients to make the cake. Who are the buyers of these cakes? For a large bakery, the buyers might be a chain of grocery stores that will buy the cakes and then resell them to the end consumer. Or, if the bakery is selling directly to the end consumer, the buyer could be that end consumer. It's important to identify which buyer we're talking about. So depending on whether we're talking about a chain of grocery stores that might be buying thousands of cakes, or one consumer who's buying a single cake, the level of power will be very different. Also remember that when we're analyzing the end consumer, we're literally analyzing the bargaining power of that one person. When we go out and buy a cake, we mostly go out and buy one single cake. We're not coordinating the purchase with all our friends. So it's not all of our friends going out and negotiating on the best possible price and service for a cake. We're alone. So some of the factors that affect bargaining power: the number and size of the buyers and sellers, the importance of the buyer, how important or vital the product being negotiated is, and the ability of each of the parties to enter each other's industry. Who has the power when we look at the bakery versus the individual consumer? So let's apply those factors that we just looked at. So the number and size of buyers and sellers. There's one large bakery. If that's the only large bakery in town and the only place to get cake, they'd have a lot more power. Compare that to one small consumer who's going to buy one cake. The bargaining power will be in favor of the factory. How important is the buyer? It's one little buyer. He's going to buy one cake. If that buyer decided not to buy a cake, it wouldn't have very much of an impact on the bakery. So it gives the bakery a lot more bargaining power. They're less likely to lower their price to sell one extra cake. Is the item vital to the buyer? There's probably other substitutes. If that buyer just wants something sweet, they could buy cookies, or they could buy donuts, or they could buy ice creams, or they could buy chocolates. There's lots of substitutes. It's not essential to have that cake. This gives the consumer a little bit of power at least. And this last question isn't as relevant, but could they enter each other's industries? The only way this might apply here might be if the consumer decides to bake their own cake at home. So I'll give that a half-size tickie. So overall, the amount of bargaining power in this analysis tends to somewhat favor the bakery. Let's do that same kind of analysis, but this time it's the bakery compared to a large chain of grocery stores. Who has the power in this case? Let's look at the number and size of buyers and sellers. A large grocery chain could potentially approach any number of bakeries and ask for quotes on supplying cakes. And if we're looking at chains of grocery stores and volume purchases of cakes, there's really not that many large chains of grocery stores to sell to. So this is going to give a little bit more power to the grocery store chain when they're negotiating to buy cakes at a pretty good price that they can resell. How important is the buyer? Well, grocery stores sell a lot more than just cakes. So if the grocery store couldn't get a good deal on the cake, it wouldn't put them out of business. They've got lots of other options, whereas the bakery really needs to sell that cake in order to stay in business. This makes the grocery store pretty important, and it gives them more negotiating power. Is the item vital? Similar to what we looked at before, grocery stores sell a lot more than cake. So it's not really all that important that they are able to buy the cake. The grocery store can then continue to sell all of the other food items. This gives the chain of grocery stores that much more power still. And finally, could they enter each other's industries? Potentially, the bakery could open up its own stores and sell directly to consumers. And I suppose potentially the grocery store could also bake its own cupcakes Unlikely that it would want to do that. In a sense, it probably gives a little bit of power. I'll give a small check mark to the bakery. Overall, though, it's clear that most of the bargaining power that takes place in this negotiation would be held by the grocery stores. Let's look at a few more examples. Pet owners really want to keep their pets safe. And so one technology that's becoming more popular is to insert a small microchip under the skin of cats and dogs, about the size of a grain of rice, and it's got a computer chip inside of it that can transmit data that will provide authorities with the name and address of the pet's owner if the pet should get lost. So the industry that's producing these small microchips for pets needs to buy the actual chips from one of the current players that produces microchips. So it turns out that probably over 90% of all the microchips produced are produced by one of two extremely large companies. But let's look at the analysis. So there's very few large suppliers of microchips. Those suppliers of microchips have many possible customers. They're used in computers and cell phones and any number of toys and devices. The producers of the chips that go into protecting our pets are very small. So they don't purchase a lot of microchips. They really represent a small percentage of the business of companies like Intel and AMD. So they'd become unimportant. This would give much more bargaining power to the microchip suppliers. And the microchip is vital. So this would give the bargaining power of the microchip suppliers, such as Intel and AMD, an incredible amount of power. One last example, the buyer would be McDonald's, who's purchasing potatoes, and the supplier would be small farmers. So there's very few large fast food chains available that would purchase large quantities of potatoes from the farmers. So this would give fast food restaurants such as McDonald's a lot of bargaining power. Because of their size and the amount that they buy, they'd be very important customers. They'd have more bargaining power. There are hundreds of small little farmers, so many possible suppliers for McDonald's to buy from. It would give them a lot more bargaining power. So just to conclude some of the factors that we looked at that affect bargaining power: the number and size of buyers and sellers, the importance of the buyer, how vital the item being negotiated is to the buyer, and the ability of each of the players to enter the other's industry.